joined. Just to let you know, Matt, who was originally due to host this evening's event, is unwell, I'm afraid. I'm his colleague, and I'll be hosting this evening's event. And if you need to ask questions, just pop them into the question facility on your GoToWebinar toolbar, and I'll come back to them at the end of the session. Right, we'll kick off. First of all, just very briefly, who on earth are we, CV and Interview Advisors? We're a partner of ACCA Careers, but we are a separate company. We provide, and the reason why I mention this is just to, for those who are not aware of our existence or seen any of our material, it's important you understand that what we do is we spend a lot of time working for our clients, individuals possibly like yourselves, who are interested in improving their prospects at getting interviews and ultimately jobs. Now we do this across the globe for all sorts of functions, but accounting and finance and IT are probably our core areas. So it's important for you to realize that what we do, we know works out in the marketplace. More of that later. We didn't just wake up one morning thinking this would be a good idea to talk to people about. We actually do provide genuinely effective CV writing, LinkedIn profile writing, interview coaching services to the public. Just so you know, from my own background and perspective, and again, I only make reference to this so that you have hopefully some confidence in the fact that we know what works in the marketplace and what doesn't. I have been an employer in the past and recruited people as an employer. I have been a recruiter, and I have been a reviewer of CVs for Matt and his business, as well as writing quite a few CVs. So me and my colleagues see things from a fairly large macro level. We know what works, we know what doesn't work, we know what's going on in the marketplace at a given moment in time, and the kind of challenges people face in trying to get interviews and interest in their experience and career. Same is true of my colleagues. Interestingly, we have some published authors amongst our midst as well. That will become important, as you'll see later. And there are going to be a few cliches flung around in today's event. One of those is hot skills. It's really important if you're going to build an effective CV, one that will make a difference. You've got to understand the hot skills in your marketplace. Hot skills are changing, they develop and evolve over time. What was hot 5 months ago, 5 years ago, 15 years ago may not be so now. But if you don't align your CV to those hot skills, i.e. what your target market is expecting to see, then you're already on the back foot. Your CV will be less effective than you might like. Bottom line, as I've said a number of times now, is that we know how to write a CV that generates interest, gets interviews, makes a difference, and we'll today be talking about a number of steps that you can take to make that same difference. And during the session, I'm going to be asking quite a few questions of your own CVs, not one-to-one, we can't do that, don't have the time or luxury of time, but to get you to think about certain characteristics of your existing CV so that you can begin to assess whether you've got a document that you think will work if you don't know that already. Interestingly, after running one of these sessions, in fact it was one of the sessions I ran a couple of weeks ago or so, we got some commentary back from somebody, which is quite nice, again just to help prove that what we talk about does work in the marketplace. I won't read this verbatim, but you can see for yourself. This is somebody who watched the webinar, we then helped them. They'd been really struggling for a number of years to get interest in the marketplace. Their situation wasn't unique, but was challenging. They had some issues with their career, gaps in their career, had been unemployed for a reasonable amount of time. This is somebody in the UK. It's been a tough economic climate, as probably most of you will know, particularly so in the UK, and this person had struggled in that environment. We helped them with the CV, and all of a sudden they started getting people interested in them, and it actually looks like that person's going to be getting a job pretty soon. They've got enough interviews, second interviews, and then progressed. So again, just reinforces the fact that if you follow the steps we're going to talk about this evening, it will make a difference. So let's talk a little bit about how on earth you assess whether your CV is up to the job and whether it can help make the difference that you might like it to. So one of the first things that we ask of people when we're assessing whether their CV is working or not is whether they're in effect just going to market with a list of jobs, qualifications, contact details, hobbies, interests, etc., etc. Now you may say, well, surely that's what a CV is about, and that would be a fair question, and it's where most people, I have to say, probably start. I review literally thousands of CVs every year, and of that, probably the vast majority are in effect just lists of things that that person's done. That's bad habits, really. People learn how to write a CV from various sources. They follow a friend, follow a colleague, maybe read a few books, look on the internet these days for advice and guidance, most of which isn't particularly helpful. More on that later. But in effect, if you ask yourself a question, if you do a bit of self-diagnosis right now and think, okay, what's my CV actually saying? Is it just presenting a list of facts to my target audience? Well, if it is, that's probably a bit of a danger sign for reasons that will become clear shortly. There are many out there also who use a CV format that's pretty much the same as it was when they left education. Most people write a CV for the first time after they've left school, college or university, or during those processes and times in their lives. Quite a few people then go on just to add to that CV over time. And over time, obviously, it becomes longer, but also the information on the CV, if you follow that format, just becomes less and less relevant. Now, this is a particular problem for anybody who's got a career that starts certainly in the 1970s, definitely the 1980s, more than likely in the 1990s, and probably now even for some people that began in the early noughties. So if you've got a CV that in its effect just the same format as when you started out in your career and all you've done is add to it, that's also a warning sign and something you should be very wary of. So ask yourself that question, is it a yes or a no? I mentioned hot skills before. It will crop up again later, but it's the best way of describing whether you're matching your CV to what your audience is expecting to find. So for many of you amongst the attendees this evening, things like a knowledge of SAP or CRM systems or ERP systems or various versions of accounting systems, whether you've worked in multi-currency environments, multi-site environments, multinational environments. Those are hot skills, things that people in the marketplace are expecting to see. In Europe, a hot skill right now is whether you've managed to trade successfully through fairly tough financial cycles. And if you've had experience of managing a business or being involved in a business within a financial function which has had to endure those tough circumstances, that's a hot skill. It's maybe not a pleasant one, but it's a hot skill. That experience of having to deal with those kind of rapidly changing financial circumstances for a lot of businesses is something that a value is placed upon. Whereas if you whiz back 6 or 7 years, it was less relevant because we haven't entered the maelstrom that we've just been through. So aligning your CV, if you're aligning, if you don't know what the hot skills in your marketplace, it's highly unlikely your CV will be aligned to them. Therefore, that is also a warning sign, something you need to be wary of. And linked to that, and I've mentioned this word again, it will crop up again, target audience. Your target audience is a combination of people. It could be recruiters, it could be employers, it could be HR hiring managers or HR members, or members of an outsourced team looking after recruitment for a particular client or employer. It's likely to be a bunch of people, a combination of those types of folk. Your CV has got to be aligned to their expectations. So in their mind, there will be a type of person that they're looking for a particular job. They will assess the competencies that you have through a variety of means. CV be one of them. Interview, if you get that far, will be another, and some kind of assessment centre may be another on top of that. Your CV's got to meet that first challenge of getting across a particular message that the target audience would be excited by, would be compelled to interview you by. And if it isn't, it's highly likely you'll get rejected at the early filtering stage of the interview process or recruitment process. So if you're not even sure who your target audience is and what their expectations are, it's highly unlikely your CV is positioned to their needs. And again, a warning sign, something that probably tells you need to do something. Ultimately, our view, and probably the strongest message you should take away from today's event, is that whatever you do, however you go about it, your CV needs to present a business case, a strong business case as to why somebody should be bothered to interview you or not. So by business case, we'll spend a lot of time today talking about that. Most of the session will be how to build a business case on your CV and LinkedIn profile. But it is materially and substantially different from just providing your audience with a list of things that you've done. And that's the biggest difference. And it's much like anybody today who's been involved in having to secure funding, raising money, justifying an investment in software, equipment, capital expenditure, whatever. You don't just turn up at somebody's desk more often than not and say, I need £1 million or £100,000 or $10,000 or 50 euros to do this, that or the other. Life's not like that. You have to justify the investment that you're either representing or that your managers are sponsoring. There needs to be a business case for that investment or capital requirement. And it's pretty much the same with you as an individual. Like it or not, in most environments, you are seen as a product or service, a solution to somebody's problem, which will cost an amount of money. And it doesn't matter how you're paid, when you're paid, and how much you're paid. In effect, you're still representing an investment of a human piece of resource. And you have to justify, ideally, to your marketplace why you'd offer a good return on that investment. And the CV needs to be a pretty strong clue as to that justification. And that's the biggest difference between a CV that's professionally written and tackles that requirement and most people's CVs as they currently stand. Most people's CVs fail to present a business case to their target audience. So we'll deal with how to tackle that for the balance of the session. So unsurprisingly, in trying to provide some kind of summary to a good CV, a bad CV, it is a fairly black and white issue, but a good CV is a business case, something that represents a strong business case to your target audience as to why they should consider interviewing you. And I stress interview. It's not giving you the job. The CV is unlikely to get you the job. It does in some cases, surprisingly, but more often than not, the interview is the tool to get, sorry, the CV is the tool to get you the interview. There are a whole host of other things that actually get you the job. A bad CV, therefore, is just a list of things because most people can generate a list of things. It doesn't differentiate you from your competition. Now, a few people have started asking questions already about, which I've seen. I'm not going to deal with them separately now. As I say, we'll deal with them at the end of the session. But a few people have said, okay, well, what difference does having a good CV make? And that's a fair question, and we tend to get asked that a lot. On average, if you have a CV that's well constructed, that makes the business case, whether you do it, we do it, or anybody else does it, as long as it's done properly, we tend to see a substantial double-digit increase in interview success, on average between 30 and 50%. We'll come on to that statistic very shortly because it's really important, but it can make a material difference. So, given all that I've said, you'll probably now start to have a picture in your mind about whether your CV may be up to the job or not. Now, if you're active in the job market, or have been recently active in the job market, you'll already have the most important piece of information at your disposal. Whether you recognize it for what it is or not is a different matter. And that is what we call the acid test for a CV, and that's the number of interviews your CV gets you against the number of applications that you've made. So let's take a typical person. They've applied for 10 jobs. The caveat, of course, is that the 10 jobs they've applied for are reasonable. So if you're just qualified and you're a junior accountant or similar and you're trying to be a nuclear submarine captain, it doesn't matter who writes your CV and how it's done, it's unlikely to have the desired effect. So that's an exaggeration to make a point. But if you're looking to move into a similar job or a slightly bigger job, it's a bit of a stretch, that's fine. you should be stretching yourselves, I guess, to some degree. People want to do that and better themselves. So let's imagine you're applying for 10 jobs that are reasonable for you to be performing. You know you could technically do the job. If you're not getting any interviews for those 10, it points to the CV being the problem. Now, it sounds logical, but you'd be surprised how many people blame the economy, a number of people out there looking for jobs, a whole host of reasons other than their CV. The harsh reality is, whether anybody actually tell you this to your face or not is a different matter, but the harsh reality is if you're not getting interviews for jobs that you know you could perform, it's nearly always the problem of the CV. Whatever you're sending your target audience, they don't like the message. They don't find it compelling enough, and they don't feel the need to want to call you to interview. Now, it's unlikely you'll ever get that feedback as bluntly as that. Unfortunately, it would be useful if people would tell you the truth. But what you'll tend to hear if you're unsuccessful in the job market is things like, there were better people for the job. Well, how do they know they were better? The only means they can make that decision in the early days of the recruitment process is what you've sent them on your CV. So what they actually mean is your CV is not strong enough. Our judgment of your skills based on what you've sent us is not compelling us to interview you. That's what it really means. If people say, oh, well, you're over or underqualified, again, that's a bit of a smokescreen normally. What people really mean is whatever they saw on your CV, again, did not compel them to want to interview you. Now, most of the reasons that you'll hear if you're in that camp will sound plausible, and unfortunately will divert you from the reality, which is the CV's letting you down. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule, but by and large, we know. We talk to employers, we've been employers ourselves, we watch what goes on, we talk to recruiters, and the harsh reality is if you're not getting the interviews, it's the CV that's the problem. Then, of course, what happens next is pretty critical. There are still some people out there who refuse to believe the CV is the problem and don't do anything about it and therefore remain unsuccessful. So our advice to people, of course, is you must do something about it. If you're not getting a satisfactory level of interviews for your job applications and you know you can technically do the job, then, as I say, the CV would seem to be the problem, so do something about it. And you can either fix it following the steps I'll talk with for the remainder of today's session, or you get professional help and pay somebody to do it, which is a viable option for some people. Plenty of people within the ACCA careers group who've been invited to these webinars have done exactly that, and it's made a difference, as I showed you earlier on that opening slide, the email we received. But the key thing is do something. Don't go into denial. Don't imagine that something will magically change. Now, for those people who are getting 7, 8, 9 interviews out of the 10 applications they make, it would indicate that their CV is doing a very good job. And certainly if it's in the 8, 9 or 10 out of 10 range, to be honest, I'd be quite happy with that. If something's going wrong further on, that's not the CV's problem, that's maybe interview skills or something else that's going wrong later in the stage. But to get in front of people, to get interviews is the job of the CV. So analyse your performance and then make a decision. You may not have a problem, it may be absolutely fine, and in which case we'd say fine, happy days. But if you have an issue, or you think you might have an issue, and you want to do something about it before getting the horrible statistics back, as I say, you can do something about it, and then there are choices. Now, what we're going to talk about now is how to pull the CV together and what the structure should look like and the key bits of content that if you get right will build this business case that I keep going on about. So on the screen now is what we believe to be an effective CV structure in order of the segments that we would tend to, or sectors that we tend to put on a CV that we would write for one of our clients. So this loose structure, we know if you get the content right, and the content is absolutely key. So just following this structure per se and then putting lousy content in it will not make the blindest bit of difference. We'll talk about the content very shortly, but this structure works, we know that. You get the content right in each of the structures, but particularly the top 3, as we'll see, we know will start to make the difference that I've highlighted at the bottom of the slide and talked about earlier, this 30 to 50% increase in success ratio at getting interviews will materialize if you get this structure sorted and properly populated with good, effective content. Now, what we're going to talk about predominantly, we're going to talk about all of those sections, but the ones we're going to really feature are the top 3. And it's those 3 sections, if you get those right, they in effect are most of the business case, or form most of the business case as to why somebody should consider interviewing you. Okay, so let's take a look at those one by one. Now, many people, and again, I'll try and give you some kind of pointers to how your CV may currently look. Many people do open up with a summary statement. They call it a professional profile or a personal profile or personal summary. It doesn't really matter what you call it. It's the content that's important. We tend to call our opening statement a professional or an executive summary, but as I say, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is what actually fills the space. And what our view is, and what seems to work best, is, and what, funnily enough, most people don't do, is describe what on earth you are. Now, this could be, and all of this content and everything I talk about this evening, of course, is bespoke to the individual. You can't overly generalize about these things because everybody's different. But by and large, and I'll be showing you some examples, both of a real-life CV and also typical content that would fill these gaps very shortly. But within this opening statement, the what are you bit is a reflection of partly what you genuinely are. So if you're a management accountant, that's a fairly well-recognized general and generic term to explain somebody's abilities in a particular area of finance. So we would be saying that, you know, maybe the first sentence ought to be something akin to, you know, I am an experienced management accountant. That's the sentiment you're trying to send. And it may sound very obvious, but you'll be surprised how many people don't do it. They leave the what they are until their work experience with their job title, which may be well down page 1, maybe even on page 2 of their CV. And if you're applying for a job, just remember, in most parts of the world, you're going to be up against tens, if not hundreds, of competitors for the same job. And a recruiter is probably going to give you 5 to 20 seconds of their time in that initial filtering. So if they've got 100 applicants, they're not going to spend very long looking at each CV. They're going to be looking very briefly at how to get that 100 applications down to a more manageable size. And if you haven't made it clear what you are, and all they've done so far is review this pile of applicants and seen that there's a welder, a project manager, a so-and-so, and a something or other, which don't appear to be anywhere close to what this recruiter's looking for, there's a very strong chance you'll get put in the reject pile simply because they can't be bothered to go through your CV in any more depth. So the biggest surprise for a lot of people is having put a nice CV together, or what they think is a nice CV together, and opened it up with all sorts of wonderful things about what they can do and what they offer, by not making it very clear to the recruiter or the target audience exactly what they are and the proposition they have, and what they can bring as, in terms of the relevance to the job being advertised. If you don't make that very clear very quickly, there's a real risk you can get rejected within literally 5 to 10 seconds of reading time, only because all the other people that the recruiter has seen up until that moment in time aren't right for the job, and you'd be surprised how many people aren't right for the job, in some cases spectacularly so. So my example of a welder applying for an accounting job is not actually that big an exaggeration. Often recruiters will get applications for jobs, sometimes because of technical mistakes and errors, and sometimes because somebody has just literally been applying for everything they see. And you need to differentiate yourself from the time wasters and make sure that you've staked a claim to a justifiable reason as to why you should be considered for being interviewed. And that, the very first part of that is making very clear that you are a valid applicant for the job. So the what are you is some kind of summary about, either generically or specifically because of your title, what exactly you are. The second bit is, as I will show you an example shortly, what is your value proposition? So again, a bit of a cliche, but if somebody's going to invest a certain amount of money in you as an individual, what is the core proposition you have to offer? What is your core skill, your reason for being, the biggest opportunity for you to return something in that investment somebody's going to make in you? It needs to be a fairly clear statement. I'll show you an example shortly. Linked to that are normally most people have 3 or 4 things that they're particularly good at, which are relevant to the job. And again, it's assuming that you can link all of this to what the target audience judge to be the hot skills in the marketplace. So as soon as they read this opening statement, what they're thinking is, hallelujah, here's a valid applicant for the role, somebody who seems to be in the right space. I will read on further, or I'll put this person into the maybe pile for further consideration, rather than instantly rejecting you because they couldn't understand why you'd applied for the job. Here's an example of a typical opening professional executive summary, whatever you want to call it, for, in this case, it's a fairly senior finance person. But what I would stress, and some people make the point during the webinars, that, oh yeah, but I've only just qualified, or I've only got a year or two's experience. It doesn't matter what level you're at, how much experience you have, or how little experience you have, what part of the world you work in, what role you have. It doesn't matter. None of those things matter. Everybody can write a far more compelling opening statement on their CV than they probably have right now that meets all of the credentials I've just talked about. So everybody can say what they are. Everybody can provide some kind of idea on the return on somebody's investment they offer. Everybody can say what they're reasonably good at. Everybody can align that with the hot skills. How close you get is another matter, but everybody can make a pretty good stab at that. I'll let you read that paragraph yourselves because I'm not going to read it verbatim, but it addresses each of those issues that we've just talked about. Now, remember, note at the bottom, we're trying to build a business case here as to why somebody should consider interviewing you. Another good self-diagnostic check. I would imagine most people on this webinar this evening, if they've got any kind of opening statement on their CV, I guarantee 3/4 at least will have some kind of reference to interpersonal skills, enthusiasm, commitment, dynamism, ability to give 110%, ability to work in a team or as an individual. If you've got any of those behavioural comments, I would recommend getting rid of them as quickly as possible because they don't add any value to your CV. How does a recruiter decide whether you are more or less enthusiastic than anybody else? They can't, based on a CV. They might when they meet you, but you've got to get that interview in the first place. So don't make any reference to stuff you can't prove on a CV. You can't prove your level of enthusiasm on a CV. You can't prove whether you work well as in a team as well as as being an individual. You can't do any of those things. So don't mention it. Don't open up your CV with the least valuable bits of information. They are important attributes, and this is where people get confused. Of course, employers want enthusiasm, dedication, commitment, passion, but they'll judge those when they meet you or at assessment centre. And in fairness, they probably won't accurately judge you on any of those things until you've been working for them for 2 or 3 months. Now, the CV's job is not to get you 2 or 3 months into a job. The CV's job is to get you the interview that may lead to a job offer. So on the CV, you need to be presenting a business case. The business case is starting, what are you, what value have you got to offer, what are you good at, and is that aligned to what the target audience is expecting to see? If you get those things right, you're automatically very much further down the line of getting interest and attention from the target audience. So that's the first and most important, not the most important part, that's the first part and a very important part of getting this business case sorted on the CV. The second area of the 3 main ones is an area we call key skills, key areas of expertise, areas of expertise. Again, it doesn't really matter what you call it, but it's an area that works in 2 ways, I guess you could say. One of which is aesthetically, and it provides, as you'll shortly see, an area on the CV which you can customize and position for each job very quickly, which is important. But it also provides a solution to the problem of making sure your CV is searchable when it hits any databases or job boards or applicant tracking systems or LinkedIn even to some degree. So I'll just show you this section and then we'll show you a sample CV where it sort of all hangs together and you can start to see how the structure looks. So remembering this is the second of two areas. We've talked about the opening statement on your CV. This is the second area. And in effect, it's just a series of bullet points, typically, and they would appear on the CV much as they look like on screen right now. The number would vary. Obviously, the content would vary, but they're typically 2, 3, maybe 4-word statements or phrases. And they reflect a combination of things. They reflect, of course, skills that you have and that you could prove. That's important. But really importantly, they need to reflect, again, what the target audience is looking for. Now, these are normally relatively easy to get because they'll be in the job advertisement, the job spec. There'll be some clues as to what the target audience is actually looking for. The trick is just making sure that you reflect back those skills. And this is where the customization for each application, it needs to be considered. It doesn't mean to say you have to change these every time you apply for a job, but you certainly need to review them to make sure that you're putting into the mind of the reader the fact that you have these appropriate skills. So they're just a few examples. Typically, as you'll see on the CV shortly, we'd have maybe 5 to 7 down the left-hand side, 5 to 7 down the right-hand side, so somewhere between 10 and 14 bullet points. And it's the key skills, not everything you've got under your hat, so to speak. The importance is key here because aesthetically, as I say, it looks good, it reflects well on whatever the target audience is looking for, but electronically, as soon as your CV hits a database, if you get this right, this area is the bit that really makes your CV appear high up the list of people's searches. So folk we know, recruiters, employers, will enter phrases, keywords into a search engine or a database facility. And of course, the more reference and the better positioned those references are in your document, the more likely your CV will appear in some kind of search. So if you get this bit right, it's a really good way of driving the sort of search engine optimization bit of your CV, which is what SEO stands for, by the way, on that slide, if anybody's wondering, search engine optimization. So I say very important. Now, the other thing you'll notice here is all of the skills I've listed, and indeed any skills you ought to put on your CV, again, are functional skills that could be proven later on in the CV or at very worst at interview. There are no references, and nor should there be any references to behavioural skills. So communication skills, interpersonal skills, presentation skills, ability to work in a team or as an individual. Any of those things, again, they're not to appear in this area. They would not be helpful. A lot of recruiters and job advertisements and employers will ask for those skills. They will say a person needs to be enthusiasm, demonstrate commitment, passion. They will ask for those skills, but they're not assessing them off your CV. Just by putting them on your CV will not guarantee you an interview or give people the idea that you're a good fit. Because most employers will look at it and say, well, big deal. Everybody's claiming all these wonderful skills they've got. I'll make a judgment of those at a later stage. If you get an interview, fair enough. Obviously, you've not been harmed, but you'll not get an interview just because you've reflected those behavioural skills on your CV. Not necessarily. Okay, comment at the bottom of the CV before I show you a real-life example is seemingly very obvious, but really, really important, and that is, and I hinted at this earlier, the vast majority, so 92% as it turns out, of recruiters or hiring managers will make their decisions on who to interview based solely on the contents of your CV. Now, you might think, well, big deal, of course that's true. The message lurking behind that is that that is the contents of your CV. They have no means, no crystal ball, no special techniques or skills to judge you on anything other than what you've told them on your CV. So if your CV is not a very good presentation of your abilities, then that's all they can judge you on. That's why a lot of people get rejected for interviews, because their CV is quite poor. Technically, the individual may actually be a really good candidate. They might be very strong and very good at doing their job. But if the CVs fail to get that message across, they will not be as successful as they'd wish. And a lot of people really don't understand that as well as they should. They imagine that by some kind of amazing ethereal process that the recruiter or the hiring manager should be able to read the CV and imagine all sorts of things that actually aren't proven on it, may well be true, but couldn't possibly be determined until you meet the individual and maybe have worked with them for a while. And nobody has those mythical powers, I'm afraid, unless the recruiter or hiring manager already knows you. And so for the mathematicians amongst you, of which hopefully there should be quite a few, the difference between 92% and the 100% are those rare occasions where the recruiter or hiring manager may actually already know of you and your abilities. But the vast majority of people can only make a decision on what you've sent them. So if you've sent them, in effect, poor content, you'll be judged on that, not on your real abilities in the real world. People can't see those. That's really important. It reinforces the fact that it's all about getting this business case across on your CV to the best of your abilities. So I promised I'd show you an example of a real CV. Let me show you, indeed, it's Matt's CV, and let's minimise the screen a bit. So on screen gradually now, what you should be seeing is a CV typically in the format that we'd write for a client. This is Matt's CV, but it follows the same methodologies that we use. And you can see a couple of things. We open it up with, in this case, we call them the exec summary, and then the bullet point key skills that I talked about just. Now you'll notice here, if you want to, there's no need to read it necessarily, but again, Matt's CV follows the format. You know, what is he? What's his value proposition? What's he good at? And we'll have to assume that he's aligning them to the hot skills in his marketplace. The bullet points are key skills that are functional, that could be proven on his CV and are indeed proven on the CV, as we'll see later, in some form or fashion. There's no unnecessary behavioural comments. You'll also notice, for some people, I'll come back onto this a little bit later, but there's no reference to Matt's address. All he's got is his name and 2 contact numbers at the top of the CV. There are a number of reasons why we do that, which to varying degrees of importance can make a difference. But the general consensus is that why clutter up a CV with information that's not actually helping your cause? And in some people's cases, location is not a good thing. It could actually harm them. So mentioning your current address, if you wanted to relocate, may not help your cause, strangely. It's not that it's the worst thing in the world, but the other factor is, of course, why put information that's not that relevant at the top of your CV? What should be at the top of your CV is the most important information you can go to market with. If you've got 5 to 20 seconds of somebody's time to make the initial decision on whether you should even be considered for interviewing, make sure you're going to market with that most important information. And the most important information is, what on earth are you? Are you a valid applicant? What are you good at? Where can you bring the return on somebody's investment? And where's the proof to back it up? The business case. That's the strongest message you need to get across. So if you've got anything else on your CVs right now that are cluttering up that business case, particularly if you're leading with personal details, education, qualifications, or leaping straight into your career history without any introductory statement, all of those things are probably harming your chances. Only you'll know because of the statistics I talked about earlier, unless you get lucky. And as I said, the bottom line is, if you're getting interviews by whatever you're doing and you're satisfied with the number of interviews, happy days, go with it. But if you're not getting interviews, those may be some of the reasons why not. Okay, so we've talked about the 2 major sections so far out of the 3, professional summary, key skills. We now move on to the 3rd one, which is what we call career highlights. And it's probably the area that most people don't get anywhere close to getting right on their CV. It could be achievements. View it as achievements, if you like, of a sort. But bear in mind, on this CV that I've been describing, this sort of ideal format, we're building a business case. What we've talked about so far is what this person, and we saw on that CV, what they are, what they're good at, what their value proposition is, aligned it to the hot skills in the marketplace, made some reference to skills that they have in bullet point fashion, but there's been no proof, no evidence really yet to back any of that up. And that's where most people go wrong on their CV. They don't have, in some cases, they have no evidence to back up the claims they're making, which just won't wash in today's marketplace by and large. So we need to provide some proof, some evidence. And what we do when we're writing CVs for our clients, and what I'd encourage you to do if you're going to go off and do it yourself, is that you need to put together some evidence, but you've got to be very careful about how you do that. If you are good at writing and you can articulate well things that you've done and make it relevant to your target audience, then you'll do well in this area. If you find that difficult, I would suggest it's another indicator that you probably should seek help from a third party rather than tackle it yourself. I'll show you an example of what we do. We use a methodology called STAR. This is it's been used by many people for many purposes, but it's a really good way of being able to deconstruct complex events and reconstruct them in a nice, concise manner, either on paper or, if you're very good at it, verbally during a question and interview session. So answering competency-based questions can be really effectively done if you know this kind of methodology and can think of good examples reasonably quickly. And STAR stands for Situation, Task, Actions, Result. And here's an example. This is actually off Matt's CV, as we'll shortly see again. So we've made a number of claims on Matt's CV about what he's good at, what he can do. We then support that with, typically on most people's CVs, certainly permanent employees, we'd have 3 career highlights on the page 1 of the CV to help build the business case. So it's not the only 3 things this person's ever done, but it's 3 very relevant things that help demonstrate and prove the skills that we've claimed on the CV to date. So again, you read this example for yourself. The ERAC stands for Enterprise Rent-A-Car, so a company many might be familiar with, but it's, I don't know whether they're a global company, but they're certainly a strong UK-based car rental company. But that's not hugely important, but the first sentence of this paragraph is the situation, scene setter, description, if you like, of what on earth was going on. So Matt was involved with this business, Enterprise Rent-A-Car. They acquired an unprofitable competitor and it needed sorting out. That's the situation. The task is the responsibility on Matt's shoulders to do something, and that was that he had to go and do some things as operations manager. The actions are the bulk of the remaining text, a series of things that he did, typically 3 or 4 things, maybe 5 things that he did to affect change, make a difference, and then the final sentence, started succeeding, is the result. So it's the end conclusion, whatever came about from Matt's involvement in this particular situation. And you'll see in his case, he succeeded in rebranding the business, achieving a certain level of profitability within a certain time frame. So that, in a nutshell, and it is a nutshell, a nice concise nutshell, is a good example of how Matt has affected change, done some things, made a difference, which matches with claims that he's made on his CV about abilities that he has to do exactly those things, to affect change, make a difference, improve profitability. Here's an example of having done exactly that. As I say, most people get this wrong on their CV because they don't provide the evidence. They make lots of claims, lots of I've done this, I've done that, I'm good at this, I'm good at that, but no real proof. So if you're claiming on your CV anything about maybe saving money, improving efficiency, reducing costs, refining processes, it's not good enough just to say that you've done those things. You've got to provide the evidence to back it up, real-life examples. As I said, we choose to feature 3 of these on a typical CV, but there are some caveats. You do need to be careful. People who try this normally or have got information on their CV that gets close to being an achievement or a career highlight often pick examples that are weak. And if they're weak, so if they don't really have much of a relevance or an oomph to them, it can actually look like it's a failure. So you need to be careful about the examples you pick. As, if not more importantly, the examples have got to be relevant and targeted to whoever you're sending the CV to. So I make this example to the UK ACCA people quite a lot, and for those that are old enough to remember it, which may not be many of you, but because it goes back a while, if one of your big career highlights was that you wrote a big VisiCalc spreadsheet or possibly Lotus 123 spreadsheet, okay, it's not the end of the world, but in a world which is ruled by Microsoft Excel and Sage and stuff like that, leading with spreadsheets that were designed in the 80s and 90s is not really where you need to be at. So the relevance is a combination of things, but it's partly to do with the target audience expectations, and partly to do what, well, obviously you've been up to, and how you best fit the role being advertised. So it's really important you pick relevant, powerful examples. Don't just list anything. Not everybody can provide sort of world-changing results. So Matt effected a change in his example by returning a business to profitability within a certain time frame. Now, some people are doing relatively menial jobs, in fairness, and that's fine. So you pick examples that are relevant to that marketplace. You don't have to show that you've changed the world. You just need to show that you're capable of doing the things that somebody's prepared to pay you money for doing. But of course, if you can get some kind of KPI that's quantifiable, that helps. It's probably where we spend most of our time working with our clients, interestingly. Most people tend to be fairly modest. Some people have totally forgotten some of the good stuff that they've done, or completely undervalued or underestimated some of the stuff that they've done. But this is probably equally weighted with the other two areas in terms of importance in building the business case. So you've got a strong opening statement, yes, that helps. The bullet points help. But these areas are the real proof. They're the meat of your CV, because they're saying, I'm not just making these claims, I'm actually giving you, Mr. or Mrs. Reader, hard evidence of my ability to do what I said I could do. So it's really important you pick really good examples and then write them in a nice, consistent manner. Incidentally, again, another mistake people tend to make is that they pick maybe one really strong example that takes up, let's say, 6 lines of text. Then if they pick another example, it may appear to be slightly weaker, if only because they've written 3 lines of text. And if they pick another example, maybe it's 1.5 or 2 lines of text. Even that approach psychologically has a big impact on the reader of your CV, because it looks as if you couldn't be bothered with at least the 3rd example you've given, possibly even the 2nd example. So even the weighting and the amount of space you devote to these things makes a difference to the reader's mind. It may not to you as the writer, because you're too close to what you've been doing, and you think, oh yeah, this is really good. I'll just make a quick note about this achievement or highlight in my career. But just be wary about the space you actually give these highlights. As I'll show you now on that CV again, you'll notice when I've just tweaked the screen sizing a little bit. Right, what should be appearing on screen now for most people is Matt's CV again, but just showing all 3 sections of the business case now. So the exec sum at the top, bullet points middle, then 3 career highlights, and you'll notice the one in the middle, the second one, is the example we just talked through. But interestingly, you'll notice that each of the career highlights is equally weighted. So you can't read that and instantaneously say, well, yeah, but one of those is less important than t'other, purely by the amount of text devoted to it. And if you think that's not a valid argument, you'd be surprised how many recruiters, and then hiring managers particularly, will just automatically assume that because you've written less for something, it's less important. It's just one of those psychological tricks. So it's really important you balance the career highlights. So all 3 should be powerful in their own right, but make sure they appear to be equally balanced on paper as well, or on the page. Okay, so we've talked about now the 3 main areas of the CV that help build a business case. So a quick reminder on a couple of points. One of which is that the acid test for your CV is whether it's getting you interviews or a satisfactory number of interviews. If you're happy with a number of interviews and you think that number of interviews will ultimately result in a certain number of job offers, that's fine, that's your business, that's your judgment. If you're not happy with the number of interviews you're getting, or you believe you won't be as successful as you'd like to be based on what we've talked about so far, then it starts to help give you at least some evidence to say you should be doing something. And what that something in it is, of course, up to you. If you've got, again, a quick reminder, because we're not far off having done on the main part of this session. If you've got any questions that you want to ask, I can see quite a lot of people have been asking them, so I'll deal with those later. But again, quick reminder, any questions, just pop them into your GoToWebinar toolbar and I'll come on to them later. Now, just quickly, in terms of some of the other sections of the CV, so it's not that these are necessarily less important to have on the CV. Of course, they are important to have on the CV, but they're not the core part of building the business case. You'll be surprised how many people will be selected or rejected based on the contents of their CV about what we've talked about so far. So that sort of opening first page. So if you've got a 3 or a 4 page document, or 2-page document even, doesn't really matter. If it's beyond 1 page, there's a strong likelihood you'll be selected for interview or rejected based on that first page. Don't imagine that people will take a nice leisurely read through everything you've sent them before making an initial discussion, or decision, I should say, sorry. So the other sections that we talked about, so just remember the first 3 most important ones are professional summary, key skills, career highlights. Those are the 3 key ones. Of course, we've still not told anybody yet where you've actually been getting your work experience from if you have a career, which is quite interesting. A lot of people jump straight into that. That's dangerous for a number of reasons that I won't go into any detail, but the core of it is you don't build a business case by saying to somebody, I work here right now. And if you work for somebody that's not very well known, that doesn't help build your business case. You might get away with it if you work for like a Big 4 accountancy. You know, that might mean something to somebody, but you're still treading on thin ice because there's lots of other people that work for the Big 4 accountancies as well. So when you do get to the career history section, it is important you start in reverse chronological order. So start with your most recent or current role, work backwards. Only detail the last 8 to 10 years. Now I'll come on to what you do with your earlier career if you've got a career beyond 10 years shortly. But the detail needs to be focused on the most recent activity. Don't imagine that people are going to interview you because of what went on in the 1970s, 80s or 90s. It's not material. It's not going to help your cause. Provide some background to what you do, what you've been paid to do, and the expectations on your shoulders, but feature mainly on achievements. So if you're dumping your job description into your CV, which says, I do this, I do that, I'm responsible for this, I'm responsible for that, that's a bad sign, because lots of other people with your job title will be responsible for the same kind of things. So again, a recruiter will get really fed up with just looking at basically, here's your job description, particularly if you've done a similar job in different environments and all you're doing is repeating that, so that you talk to tax authorities, you ran payroll, you did cash flow forecasting, budget variances, reconciliations, and then you repeat that again for your earlier job and you repeat it again for the job before then. That's not building a business case, that's just a list of stuff that's of no relevance at all. Focus on the achievements that differentiate you from other people who shared your duties and responsibilities. With the earlier career, so if you've got a career that stretches back more than, say, 10 years, and that's a broad indicator. It does, as I said earlier, it all depends on you as an individual, what you're trying to do, what your background is, but as a broad indicator for the career over 10 years, just reduce each employment part of your career to 1 line. So from this date to that date, I was with such and such an employer doing such and such a role. That's it, end of. There's no need to explain what's older than that. That won't make a difference as to you getting an interview, with very few exceptions. Then you can move on to formal qualifications and continual professional development, training, etc. that you've been through. If you are ACCA qualified, for example, Prince 2 qualified, for those who've got project management bent to them, MBA qualified, degree educated, that can all be mentioned in your professional summary. So we would typically put, you know, that finance director example that we saw earlier. You could put a degree educated finance director, an MBA qualified finance director, an ACCA qualified, an FCCA qualified. You can make those core references right early on in the CV because they are important and they are differentiating. But you don't need to lead with every single detail of your education, even if you've just qualified or just left university. You do not need to be leading with your education. That is not the most differentiating aspect of your worth. As I hinted at earlier, personal details, so address, email if it's not already on the first page of your CV, ability to relocate, all those kind of things, languages, blah, security clearance if you have it. Those kind of things can be mentioned towards the back of the CV within a personal details section. And then finally, we would recommend that for those people who've got any comment about references being available on request, well, that's wholly pointless. Just think about it. If an employer wants to get references for you, they will ask for them. Whether you make them available or not, it's part of their recruitment process. It will happen whether you like it or not. Putting references available on request if you have it on your CV is wholly meaningless for those reasons. What's far more important and powerful is if you can get any testimonial evidence or recommendations, either from your LinkedIn profile if you have one, or from material that you've gathered from emails, thank yous, awards, appraisals. That's far more powerful on your CV. Okay, quick moment of reflection, as I've called it. So by now, you should have a pretty good idea whether your CV meets a number of criteria that make it sort of a positive or a negative document. As I say, the absolute acid test are a combination of things. If you're already getting the right number of interviews for the right level of jobs and you're happy with that, then fine. You can't argue with that. Whatever your CV looks like, can't argue with that. They're the hard facts. But if you're not getting interviews at the level of job you aspire to, or you're not getting interviews to any job that you've been applying for, or not enough to make the difference that you want, then it starts to point at the CV being a problem area. And recognize that rather than just listen to people's rather faint excuses as to why you're not getting the interviews. It is the CV that's the problem, I can virtually guarantee it. If you're not yet in the marketplace and you don't have those stats to evaluate, then you can only ask yourself the question, do I honestly think my CV presents a strong business case to my target audience? And you'll have a fair few clues now as to whether that's the case or not. And if it doesn't, you can do something about that. And if it doesn't have evidence of your success and abilities on it, not in a boastful way, but just is there any proof on your CV to back up the claims you'd like to make? Again, you at least can think maybe it's not going to be as successful in the marketplace when I do start applying for jobs. So then you need to make a decision. First decision, of course, is do you need to do anything at all? Second decision is if I do need to do something, do I do it myself? Third decision is if I don't do it myself, can I get or should I seek professional help? And of course, you can go down that route, and plenty have through the ACCA. And after we've talked about LinkedIn, there's some really big discounts that we offer people who've attended these webinars if you decide that you might seek professional help and want us to be involved in that. So I'm going to move on to LinkedIn now, but I just wanted to talk about one thing regarding the CV that a lot of people ask for. I'm just conscious of time now, so I won't focus as much on this area as I wanted to originally. Number of pages. A lot of people say, how long should a CV be? And there is no real answer to this. There is a bit of an urban myth in various parts of the world about how a CV should be X pages long. But in our experience, we've never had anybody come back to us and say, you're a bunch of so-and-sos, I went to market with a 2 or 3 page CV and somebody's telling it should be 1 or 2 pages and no more. The only exceptions to that are where you're specifically asked to submit a CV to a specific length. If you're asked to do that, then you should of course comply. But in all other marketplaces that we've taken any evidence from, most important thing is the quality of the content. And on average, our CVs that we write for our clients are 2 or 3 pages long, but sometimes they're 4, and they work perfectly well. It's the content that's key. LinkedIn. Let's talk about that briefly before wrapping up. So for those, I have to tread a fairly central path here. There'll be some people on this webinar who use LinkedIn, know a reasonable amount about it, have a LinkedIn profile. There'll be others that maybe don't have a profile or are thinking about it, and there may even be some who don't want to have a LinkedIn profile at any cost, and I accept all of those. So I'll tread a path that sort of explains the key things, and you can then figure out whether you're doing these or not. The comment at the bottom of the page is quite important. You remember I said earlier the vast majority of recruiters and hiring managers can only judge you on the contents of your CV, and it's something like 92%. Of that 92%, the vast majority, again, will check you out on LinkedIn before inviting you for interview. It used to be they might check you out afterwards or during the process. But now, and it's not just LinkedIn, I have to say, it's all forms of social media. So if you're into Twitter, Facebook, or any of those other things, they're out with our discussion today, but people will do a bit of digging around on you. Once they've whittled the number of applicants down to a manageable number, they'll want to see what you've been up to online and build up a profile. Now, our interest is in LinkedIn because it's a professional business network. It's not a social network in the sense of the word. So it's really important, if you've spent any time, if you've been fortunate enough to get an interview or be selected for interview, it's important that whatever you did on your CV obviously must have worked in that instance. If there's any differences or contradictions on your LinkedIn profile, there are people who stand to lose a great deal at this point, because any inconsistencies between the two documents will not help your cause. And we know of people who've lost the opportunity to get to interview because their LinkedIn profile was even worse than their CV, or worse than their CV, or had something contradictory to their CV. So make it work for you. If you're interested in new opportunities, LinkedIn is really important because it's now probably the leading way that people will find candidates' resource for a business. There are some stats around now that I think 2012 more people found a job through LinkedIn than they did through Monster.com, which was at that moment in time the world's biggest job board. And that shift is just increasing over time. LinkedIn have also spent a huge amount of money acquiring businesses that provide the analytical ability, so the really clever algorithms about matching people with opportunities. So it points to the fact that they're really taking this job search, job provision, job advertising thing seriously. It's where they earn most of their money from, interestingly now as well, selling their services to recruiters and employers, not premium memberships to individuals like you and me. And that's only going to increase. So recruiters, employers, and this may be a surprise to some people, are using LinkedIn massively to find people, sometimes before they even advertise a role, to see if there's talent out there that might be worth contacting. So if you're interested in getting an opportunity, you can either search jobs on LinkedIn or you can be found as a potential candidate, and there will be people looking for people with your skills right now, tomorrow, the next day, the day after, and ad infinitum. It's a really big area. So we say to people, if you're looking for opportunities, unless you've got a very good reason, you need to be on LinkedIn. If you're not looking for opportunities right now, but you want to build a profile in the marketplace and be in the right place, it's important for those reasons just to be seen and be noticed. But where people, again, tend to go wrong is they copy their CV and dump it into their LinkedIn profile. Now, if you've got a bad CV, you're just replicating that badness. So don't do that. The LinkedIn profile is quite a different environment from your CV. The core content or structure is similar, but how you go about presenting your message is in some areas quite different. A lot of people get hung up about filling every single box that LinkedIn's got to offer, and we would say don't bother about that. As a good example, for those of you who have a profile or have worked with a profile, you'll know that LinkedIn scores it, and it will give you a rating: intermediate, advanced, expert, and you'll get all excited because you think, yeah, I've got an expert profile, therefore I must be visible to the masses, look really appealing. That's not what it means. All it means, crudely, is that you've taken the time to fill out as much information as you possibly could on your profile, and LinkedIn has rewarded you for that. It doesn't make you a stronger candidate in the eyes of a recruiter. And although it's an exaggeration and a bit silly, those of you who've tried it, you'll notice that adding a photo to LinkedIn, which is probably generally a good thing to do, not always a good thing, but generally we'd say add a photo, that will increment your rating as far as LinkedIn's concerned by a few points. But it could be a photograph of a monkey or a banana or both, and you'd still get the increment in points. So that makes the point, really. It's all about the content. It's not about just filling boxes. It's not a form-filling exercise. And a lot of people approach LinkedIn, typically on a Sunday afternoon or a day off, quickly filling it in, think job done, get a high rating because they filled out all the content, and then wonder why nobody calls them. It's just like the CV. Content is key. There are a few areas quickly that I'll just go through to say you really need to address. And again, it's a bit like the CV with the 3 areas that make the strong business case. LinkedIn's similar. There's a professional headline. I'll show you this in a minute, but it's the area just underneath your name. It ought not to be filled with something like available now, currently seeking, looking, actively interested, please call me, or anything else like that. That's not helping your cause. That's making you look desperate. And so it needs to be something more akin to the opening statement on your CV, or the opening line on your CV, if you like, which is, what is your core value proposition? What are you on this earth to deliver? So that differentiates you from everybody else. Again, I'll show you shortly what it looks like. The summary area of LinkedIn is a bit like the professional summary on the CV, but interestingly, the way you write it is subtly different. I don't have the time to go into the nuances. It's not as if by copying and pasting a good professional summary will put you at a disadvantage, but just the style of the writing, the tense you use, is quite different on the LinkedIn profile as it is on a good CV. But it is important that you write that summary, again, to build a business case, not just to say, I'm wonderful and can do all of these lovely things. When you're putting jobs, LinkedIn will encourage you to fill out lots of detail. We recommend don't do that. Provide a summary only, not lots of detail about each job you've done. And again, an area that a lot of people don't even know exists, but you should use. I talked about career highlights on the CV. In LinkedIn, there's an area called projects. And if you haven't experimented with that, it's really worth looking at, because projects is a brilliant area for putting real examples of stuff that you've done that demonstrate to your target audience that you're capable of doing something relevant. So investigate that area and use it. And finally, as far as LinkedIn is concerned, other than showing you the professional headline area and some of those bits that I mentioned, don't forget LinkedIn, you can, if you know and have worked with your profile, you can reorder the sections. It uses drag and drop technology, and there is a better way than the standard default setting to lay out your business case, particularly if you have some projects to display. Now here's Matt's profile, and the professional headline is the text I've just, or loosely circled, ovaled. Under his name is the bit called the professional headline. Now a lot of people get suckered into thinking that they'll go with the default setting. LinkedIn by default, if you tell it to, will just take your current job title and employer, or most recent job title and employer, from your work experience area and populate this automatically. A lot of people fall into that trap thinking, oh, that's easy, that's one less thing for me to do, isn't this clever, I'll take the easy option. And it might work. Again, it's not the most hideous thing you can do, but if you've got an odd job title that doesn't mean anything to anybody outside your current business, or isn't what you aspire to be, again, you're just starting your business case with, here's my name, here's what I am, and if that what I am isn't what you'd like to be, your target audience isn't going to know that. They're just going to take you at face value and say, well, this person's a junior accountant or a management accountant, and if you want to be something else, or if you're a financial controller but you really want to be a financial director, you're not really sending the best message to your target audience. So think very carefully what you put in that box. There is a limited amount of text, but you can normally get quite a good message across. The summary I've just highlighted because, again, this is an area. Now, you'll notice there's a tense difference. Matt's now saying, I do this, I do that. On his CV, he wasn't saying that. And that's an important distinction for reasons I won't go into in detail now. But that just highlights LinkedIn and CV, similar but not the same. And that's important. But the summary here on LinkedIn is, again, building the business case. Why should somebody be interested in approaching Matt or his business? Well, here's the reason, and it describes some of the benefits he can offer. Okay, so that's that for the content. I'll come on to the questions in a bit, but I did promise halfway through that lot that for those that have got to a point where they're thinking, I certainly need to do something, not quite sure whether I'm up to doing it myself yet, might consider professional help. If you're thinking about that, I promised a special offer for those people who have attended today's webinar, and that is that our normal prices, and I'm afraid writing a good CV, a LinkedIn profile, and actually a cover letter as well, which you get as part of this deal, is not the work of a moment. The process goes something like that. If you're interested in getting professional help, the way we do it is we allocate you a writer who understands the market you're in. You spend a couple of hours on Skype or the phone with them. We've got writers across the world who work different functions, and you spend some time with them, and they extract from you in the nicest possible way your value proposition, the hot skills in your marketplace, your career highlights, what you've got to offer the world, what you're trying to do, where you're trying to target your career, and then they'll rewrite your CV from scratch based on those criteria. So it's not a revamp, it's not an amendment, it's not a tweak or a refinement, it's a root and branch rewrite of your CV to meet market requirements for the jobs you're interested in. We'll also do the same on your LinkedIn profile, and we'll provide you with a cover letter which you can use for a variety of applications, and we'll do that for £299 sterling. That's a substantial amount less than the normal price. In fact, it's just over £80 saving, and if you're outside of Europe, you don't pay VAT, so the prices you see are the prices you pay. If you're interested in that as a option to fix whatever issues you might have, visit this web link, which I'll just put into the chat room now, and you can click on the link, and it will take you to a page on our website which will allow you to take advantage of the offer. So I'm just pasting that into the chat room now for those people that are interested in that. The deal is a good deal, and therefore it's limited until this coming Friday, close of play Friday this week, and then our prices revert to normal. If you've got any questions about the process, or indeed want to try and establish whether you would benefit from them, just email us. Drop us an email on the email that's on the screen now, and we'll answer your queries, and we'll return an answer to you quick enough for you to be able to take advantage of that offer. Now, that's the end of the session, so hopefully you've got quite a lot of that. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate your interest in today's webinar. I promised I would answer questions, so if you just give me a couple of seconds, I'll open up the question box. For those that need to leave now, as I say, you're more than welcome to disappear. If you've got other things to be getting on with, thank you again for your time. If we can be of any help, obviously you can contact us on the email on the screen, visit our website, or take advantage of that offer that I've explained. Now I'll move on to the questions that have been asked. So let me just pause the presentation and then move on to